Alamanni, Franki, Gothini. These new names that had appeared in the Roman history books in the 3rd century belonged to the Germanic tribes that dominated the territories near the Rhine and Danube rivers. The Romans often called these people barbarians, not only because they were less technologically advanced than them, but also simply because they weren't Romans. For many Romans had considered anyone that wasn't Roman barbarians. Ever since the Romans had dominated every other nation around the Mediterranean in the 1st century BC, they had been the most powerful nation in the region. However, by the 3rd century AD, the Germanic tribes had become powerful enough to match Roman armies and make raids deep into Roman territory. This then begs the question, what changes had taken place within Germania that allowed the Germanic tribes to become powerful enough to challenge the Roman Empire? It is unfortunate that most of the Germans were illiterate during this period, so we don't have many first-hand accounts from their perspective. Much of what has been written about them has been derived from Roman sources, and most Roman historians that wrote about the Germans were only concerned about their interactions with the Roman Empire, so they don't tell us much about what happened within Germania. Only a few Romans had written about the Germans and their customs, like the 1st century historian Tacitus, and the information they provided about Germania are limited. Later historians who did write a history of the Germans, like the 6th century Gothic writer Jordanes, wrote about them centuries after the events they describe, some of which were based on stories carried down verbally for generations, so their accuracy is a little dubious. In any case, most Romans only had a superficial understanding of the Germans, and most of the historians wrote their histories based on second- or third-hand accounts, so their content may not be entirely accurate, but they still remain useful in giving us an insight into the political groupings in the area and their relationship with Rome. We also had to rely on archaeological evidence to give us some clues into the lives and practices of the northern tribesmen, and when some practices had changed during a certain time period. But archaeological evidence does not directly tell us which political group had occupied the area. By putting all the separate evidence together along with formulaic deductions made by modern historians, we could get some idea of the developments that happened within Germania. Our first clue for the political changes within Germania is that some of the tribal names mentioned in the early 1st century were no longer mentioned by the 3rd, and new names had appeared. For example, in the days of the early Roman Empire, a tribe named the Hermunduri had settled in the part of Germania north of the Roman province of Raetia. However, by the early 3rd century, a new political grouping called the Alamanni had appeared in the history books, which settled in the same area. It seems like they had replaced the Hermunduri because that name is scarcely mentioned in the sources after the arrival of the Alamanni. However, the Alamanni was also discovered to be a confederation of many different tribes, each with their own kings. The 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus mentioned that during the Battle of Strasbourg between the Romans and the Alamanni army was commanded by 7 kings and 10 petty princes. Even if not everyone in the army was part of the Alamanni, the writer had also mentioned the names of the kings without mentioning the names of any other tribes outside of the confederation, which indicates that the Alamanni was indeed a loose combination of multiple tribes, of which the Hermunduri may have been a part of. Other names from the 1st century like the Semnones and the Noristi were also no longer mentioned by the 3rd, so they may have been absorbed into the Alamanni as well. The Alamanni first appeared on our sources from the Roman historian Cassius Dio, in which he mentioned that in the year 213, some men from the Alamanni tried to find employment in the Roman army under the Emperor Agricola, but they were betrayed by the emperor and then executed. They appeared in the history books again around the year 235 by raiding the Roman Empire. The Romans that were sent to defeat them seem to have failed in this task, for the Roman Emperor Severus Alexander had offered to pay the Alamanni for a peace treaty. This had brought the ire of his fellow Romans, who had killed him and replaced him with Maximinus Thrax, who then gathered so many soldiers to fight the Alamanni that the historian Herodian wrote that it seemed like all the soldiers of the empire were sent to defeat them, which they did, but at the cost of heavy casualties. Throughout the 3rd century, the Alamanni continued to raid the empire and battled Roman armies. Some of the raids even went deep into the province of Italy. They had also managed to take over territories that are once Roman. by occupying old Roman forts and villas while creating new ones, and had firmly placed themselves there by the end of the 3rd century. To the north of the Alamanni, another confederation had also been formed, called the Franks. This confederation was composed of the Germanic tribes that settled in the Lower Rhine, like the Chatti, Chamavi, Bructeri, Batavi, and Ambivari. These tribes had existed during the 1st century, and it seems like they started grouping together by the mid-3rd, because it was from this point on the name Frank started to appear. The name Frank supposedly means the free in their language, and they appeared in the history books through their daring raid that started around the year 257 when they rampaged through Gaul, Spain, and even Africa. At some point, the Romans had defeated the Frankish raiders and dragged the survivors all the way towards an area near the Black Sea where they should have no longer posed a threat. However, the Franks seized some of the ships and went on a huge expedition all across the Mediterranean, raiding the provinces of Greece, Sicily, and Africa before sailing back to their original homeland. The tribes in these confederations also seem to have operated with a certain degree of autonomy while still being identified under a single appellation by the Romans. This has been demonstrated by the fact that after the Battle of Strasbourg, the Emperor Julian had made peace with each of the Alamanni kings separately, even though they had all been in one army. Sometimes, a single tribe could be at war without involving the other members of the confederation, like when the Alamanni tribe called the Nothargi had attacked the Romans while the other tribes remained at peace with Rome. We don't know how exactly these confederations came together, but they may have taken generations to form as other tribes continued to join them throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries. For example, the Alamanni had been found raiding with the Dragunthi during the 3rd century before becoming part of the Alamanni by the mid-4th. As for the Franks, the Batavi had a long history of allegiance to Rome, but they eventually became part of the Salian Franks by the 4th century. Some of the tribes had even retained their old names, like the Chamavi and Ambivari, whose name was still mentioned in the 4th century. The Romans had also found substantial recruitment from these confederations, for their soldiers had served all over the empire, from the forests of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Even in Rome's wars against the Germans, the Franks and the Alamanni had sometimes been found on both sides of the battlefield. Further away from these confederations, another new major political power had arrived in the 3rd century, but in the east. They were called the Goths, a Germanic tribe that had burst into the scene in the year 238 when they sacked the city of Histria and raided the Balkan Peninsula. Then, in the year 250, the Goths launched another campaign against the provinces of Dacia, Moesia, and Thrace. By June of the year 251, the Roman Emperor Decius responded to these attacks with a large Roman army, but the Gothic leader Cneva had lured Decius into a trap and destroyed Decius' army, killing both Decius and his son Herennius. For the next couple of years, the Goths would periodically ravage the provinces in Eastern Europe and West Asia until they were defeated by Emperor Claudius II in 268 and by Emperor Aurelian in 271. By the end of the crisis of the 3rd century, the Goths had firmly established themselves on the north of the Danube River over what had been the Roman province of Dacia. Unlike the other Germanic tribes that were previously mentioned, the original Gothic settlements were located much further away from the borders during the 1st century. Their origin story has been written down by the Gothic historian Jordanes in his book called the Gerica. He claimed the account is based on a chronicle now lost to us by a man named Ablabius. According to the work, the Goths came from the land of Scanza, an area where many Germanic nations had originated, and settled on a place called Goscanza. There, they expanded their territory by fighting other tribes like the Vandals. When their population had increased, a part of the Goths left Goscanza to settle in the land of Scythia, and it was from here that they moved to the lands of Dacia where they met the Romans. Many historians had said that the accounts in the Gerica were unreliable, mostly because Jordanes had sometimes wrongly attributed the actions of other tribes to the Goths. However, discoveries made in the 20th century had shown that Jordanes' account of the Gothic migration does coincide with the archaeological evidence. Jordanes did not mention where Goscanza was located, but many historians think the 3rd century Goths were descendants of a people called the Teutons mentioned by Tacitus in the 1st century. Their location had been noted to be alongside the Vistula River by a 2nd century Roman geographer named Claudius Ptolemy. In this area, many modern archaeologists found the remains of a distinct cultural practice that dates from the 1st to 4th century called the Wilbar culture. They also found another cultural practice in the Pontic steppes that dated from the 3rd to 5th century called the Chernakov culture. What's peculiar about these two culture types is that they have many similar practices. For example, the people of the Wilbar and Chernakov cultures practice both inhumation and cremation burials for their dead, often without weapons. This stands in contrast to the nearby Przemysław culture, which is often associated with the Vandals that only cremates their dead, usually with weapons. They also had found many of the same kind of items and customs, like the women were found wearing 2 fibula brooches, one for each shoulder, and the handmade potteries found in the early phase of the Chernakov culture were similar to the Wilbar. It is because of these cultural similarities that historians like Peter Heather believe that most of the people who followed the Chernakov culture were the Goths, which are descendants of the people who followed the Wilbar culture, like the Teutons. That doesn't mean that they were the only followers of each culture, as other tribes may have followed the same cultural trend, like the Heruli. The Chernakov culture also shared many of the same elements found in other cultures. For example, items and customs often associated with the local nomadic people were found in some burial sites, like the unique Sarmatian amulets. There were also other burial sites done in the same style as the ones found in the Przemysław culture, which means that other tribes had also joined in with the Goths. After all, the ancient sources did report that the Goths had often raided the Roman Empire with other tribes, like the Carpi and Heruli. There were some doubts by some historians about whether the archaeological evidence is indicative of a Gothic migration. After all, a change of culture in an area does not necessarily mean there was a mass migration, and the cultures could be associated with other tribes. This is where written evidence can assist the archaeological study, as the first mention of the word Latene had appeared in Roman sources around the 3rd and 4th century, which coincides with the same time period as the arrival of the Chernakov culture. The sources also mention where the Goths had raided from, which are often located in the areas that the people who follow the Chernakov culture reside in. Other clues include monuments and victory titles awarded to the emperors, like Claudius Gothicus. When the archaeological evidence coincides with multiple written sources, Jordanes' account of a Gothic migration from the north seemed all the more plausible. Now we turn to archaeology to understand how the Germanic societies had developed throughout the centuries. Due to the nature of archaeology, the evidence found is limited to whatever materials and settlements the ancient Germans had left behind, on lands that not had been dramatically altered for centuries, so modern historians couldn't get a complete picture of ancient Germania. Nevertheless, archaeologists found enough evidence to make some conclusions about the general developments, and carbon dating technology can also help us determine what time period certain items came from. The main focus would be in the areas associated with the Northern Germans, more specifically in and around the areas where the Alamanni and the Goths had originated from and settled in. One of the most important things to observe is the agricultural sector. In order to have dedicated smiths, craftsmen, and an administrative apparatus, a society needs to create enough food to have a surplus. Before the arrival of the Romans, the Germans had already developed farming, as evidenced by the many farms and settlements in Germania that date from the pre-Roman era. However, many of them had only been occupied for only a few generations, as farming would eventually exhaust the soil. This required the inhabitants to constantly change settlements, which many of them had moved around the same general area. Some ashes were also found, which indicates that they tried to use the ancient slash and burn method to maintain soil fertility, but it seemed to be insufficient for their needs. They seem to have improved their farming techniques in the 1st century, as evidenced by the growth of more longer-lasting settlements, like the Peutingeriana, which was established around the 1st century and gradually grew through the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Pollen studies also showed a gradual increase in cereal crops through the first 4 centuries, which indicates an increase of the population. Animal husbandry was also practiced, as evidenced by the animal bones found in the farms. The cattle seem to be more prominent than pigs and goats, but they are also smaller than the Mediterranean breeds. It doesn't seem like the Romans had exported them to the Germans, for they are only found in a few places in southern Germania. Historians estimated the population of Germania could be anywhere between 1 to 2 million in the 1st century to about 3 million by the 3rd. This increase in population also coincides with an increase in technological development. In the 1st century AD, most Germans were producing handmade pottery, but by the 3rd century, many of them had been producing wheel-made ones, and by the 4th century, glassware production centers had appeared near the Carpathian Mountains. There was also an increase in gold and silver craftsmanship in Germania during this period. Since these materials were rare in Germania, the Germans had to import them from their Celtic and Roman neighbors. There doesn't seem to be much trade during the pre-Roman period, because the German burial grounds from this period rarely had gold in them, so there was not much to differentiate between the graves of a low-status person and a high-status one. By the 2nd century, the increase in trade with the Romans had yielded more gold coins, which also increased the amount of golden craftsmanship in Germania. In the burial grounds dated after the 3rd centuries, archaeologists have found many German-made gold and silver ornaments in the graves of high-status people and a higher number of grave goods in other burials. This increase in wealth usually coincided with an increase in wealth inequality, which gave the kings the means to pay for personal retainers and induced the local population to carry out larger projects, as evidenced by the increase of buildings and fortifications. German steel production had also increased during this period. Shaft furnaces of many different types were scattered across Germania, but by the beginning of the 1st century, large dedicated steel production centers had been set up in places like the Czulewicz Center, which was located in Bohemia, and the Lysagora Hills, located in southern Poland. The German smelting furnaces were just as advanced as their Roman and Celtic counterparts, so they were able to make the same quality of steel as the Romans, just not on the same scale. It's possible that they've learned the art of metal forging from their Celtic neighbors who had already developed advanced crafting and agricultural methods. In the southern parts of Germania and Gaul, archaeologists found the remains of a Germanic Celtic culture called a Latene culture, which had existed in parts of Germania 300 years before Christ. From these remains, archaeologists had found wheel-made pottery, large settlements with thick stone fortifications, and princely burials filled with many various ornaments, weapons, and armor with intricate craftsmanship. This shows that the people of the Latene culture had already developed these methods much earlier than the people who lived farther north. It doesn't seem like most of the technology produced by the Celts had spread to northern Germania during the pre-Roman era, for most of northern Germania were sparsely populated, filled with forest, tougher soils, and colder temperatures. Methods that work in the Mediterranean world with its softer soils and warmer temperatures do not work as well in most of northern Europe, so some of the Europeans had to come up with new tools and methods to cultivate the lands. Even in the lands of the Celts, the Celtic farmer had developed different methods like the wheel plow to turn the tougher soils in Europe, while the Mediterranean farmer had been content with the more simple wheelless plows. Archaeological evidence also showed that Germanic weaponry and steel wielding had improved throughout the centuries. Many Germanic tribes had buried their dead with weapons and other items, and many of them had also thrown away used equipment into sacred bogs as votive offerings to their gods. For example, at some point in the 3rd century before Christ, the Germans had sunk a boat that was filled with all kinds of military equipment in a bog called Jurtspring. The Germans had also ritually thrown weapons and equipment into places like the Vimos and Thorsberg bogs from the 2nd to 5th centuries. From these areas, archaeologists found a varying array of weapons, shields, armor, and tools, but most of the organic materials had rotted away before archaeologists had found them, so they had to determine what these items were by what remained of them. However, some parts of the Thorsberg deposit had contained well-preserved sets of organic materials like cloaks, trousers, shirts, and even a full shield. Since these items had been placed there through different time periods, historians could get a general idea of how Germanic weaponry had developed in ancient times. The deposits revealed that before the 1st century AD, the Germans had a scarcity of iron. Most of the weapons they used only needed to have a small amount of iron to be made, like daggers, spears, and javelins, and some of the javelins were tipped with bone instead of iron. The deposit had very few swords, and most of them were single-bladed. Chainmail armor and metal shield bosses were also found, but they are rare, which indicates that most of the body protection they used were only made of organic materials. This changed during the Roman period, as evidenced by the greater prevalence of swords, all of which were double-sided, very similar in design as the ones produced by the Celts and Romans. There has also been a greater number of shield bosses, but not a large increase in armor, though it's possible that the Germans acknowledged that it would be better to keep those instead of throwing them away, unlike the swords, which are usually bent out of shape before being thrown away. We don't know if Thor had rewarded the Germans for their votive offerings, but they certainly gave their descendants a lot of information about what they had used in ancient times. These new developments helped the Germans maintain a more robust political identity. Building confederations was not a new phenomenon for the Germans, but when they had created confederations before the 1st century, they usually broke apart after the death of a charismatic leader or when their armies were defeated. But in the 3rd century, the confederations like the Franks and the Alamanni stayed intact for multiple generations. The excess of wealth had given the kings the ability to purchase more extravagant clothing and build more elaborate buildings and fortifications, so the people were able to easily identify and acknowledge who the rulers were of the kingdom. With more resources, dedicated production centers, and a well-established hierarchy, the Germans were able to summon larger and better-equipped armies than they had before. Their formidable Sarmatian and Dacian neighbors that had dominated the East in the 2nd century had become increasingly irrelevant by the 4th century, until they were either taken over by the Germans or absorbed into the Roman Empire. It's also noted that a large portion of the Roman army consisted of Germans who would have learned Roman tactics and copied Roman equipment. Many of them would have retired back to their own tribe and brought their lessons with them, so by the late 4th century, a regular observer would scarcely see a difference between the average Roman soldier and a German one.